At midnight, she was just bathed in the strobe lights of a Lady Gaga concert, like surrounded by thousands of people ringing in the new year at Miami's legendary Fontainebleau Hotel.
Right, which is just the absolute pinnacle of South Beach glamour. I mean, the champagne is flowing, the bass is vibrating through the floor.
Exactly. And she is right in the center of it, entirely alive, glowing with a kind of, magnetic energy that just naturally pulls people toward her.
She was the kind of person you notice when she walks in a room.
Yeah. But then I want you to fast forward just 14 hours. It's a quiet Sunday evening, January 3, 2010. We're standing on this desolate, dead-end street at Northwest 14th Avenue and 130th Street in North Miami.
Which is a completely different world from South Beach.
Completely. It is an industrial sprawl, concrete chain-link fences, a nearby propane company. The area is essentially a ghost town on a Sunday.
Right. Nobody's working in those warehouses on a Sunday night.
No one. But a local resident happens to be walking nearby and notices this thick, just acrid smoke billowing from an industrial dumpster. So he dials 911.
He probably assumes it's just teenagers starting a trash fire, right?
That's exactly what he thought. But when the fire department arrives and they blast the flames with water, the smoke clears to reveal a horrifying reality. This isn't burning trash. It's the body of a young woman.
The contrast between those two locations, I mean, the pulsing, hyper-visible world of the Fontainebleau at midnight and that pitch-black, isolated dumpster in North Miami, it's just staggering.
It gives you whiplash just thinking about it.
It really does, and it perfectly encapsulates the terrifying velocity of this crime. In less than a single rotation of the Earth, a vibrant 26-year-old woman was violently removed from one of the most crowded, heavily surveilled party environments in the world.
And reduced to an unrecognizable Jane Doe in an industrial wasteland.
Exactly. The fire was so intensely destructive that when investigators initially looked at the remains, they couldn't even determine her hair color.
Wow.
Yeah, her facial features were entirely gone. The only immediate clues left behind were a few metal piercings and earrings that somehow managed to survive those extreme temperatures.
Her name was Paula Sladewski. She was a 26-year-old aspiring Playboy model.
And if you look at photos of Paula from that weekend, you see a woman who just commanded attention.
She really did. She had this striking blonde presence. But people who knew her always talked about her warmth, like she wasn't just a face.
Right. She was the kind of person who remembered your name, who actually cared about the conversation she was having with you.
Yeah, she made you feel seen. But somewhere between the neon-lit exit of a downtown Miami nightclub and that grim, isolated dumpster roughly 12 miles away, Paula was completely erased.
And to understand the mechanics of how this happened, how a woman could vanish from a packed venue and end up the victim of such a calculated disposal, we really have to look at the immediate environment she was navigating.
And more importantly, we have to look at who she was navigating it with.
Yes, because in this investigation, the immediate assumption of the police, and frankly, the immediate assumption of the public, was heavily colored by a profoundly dark, documented history of violence.
It really is impossible to analyze the events of January 3rd without first understanding the psychological gravity of Paula's life leading up to that night.
You have to look at where she came from.
Right. So Paula was born on November 15th, 1983, in Garden City, Michigan. This is a working-class environment, and by all accounts, her youth was incredibly difficult.
She was dealing with a deeply troubled home life.
Yeah, a largely absent father, and she was forced to navigate highly inappropriate adult situations from an unacceptably young age. She just didn't have a safety net.
And when a child grows up without that fundamental safety net, they often develop one of two coping mechanisms, right? They either shrink away from the world or they learn to project this oversized, impenetrable confidence to protect themselves.
And Paula definitely did the latter. She developed this massive outgoing personality.
But beneath that charisma, there was a real drive for escape. She wanted out of Garden City.
She wanted financial independence.
Exactly. And she recognized early on that her physical appearance was a viable currency in an industry that could provide that escape.
That ambition led her into the modeling world, and she chased it hard. She actually landed a spot in the 2003 Playboy: The Ultimate Playmate search video.
Which is huge. For a young woman from a rough background in Michigan, that is a massive validation.
It's a taste of the exact life she was aiming for.
Right. But the reality of the entertainment industry is that it's rarely a straight line to the top.
Yeah, it's feast or famine. When the high-profile modeling jobs dried up, or when the rent was due and the auditions just weren't paying, Paula sometimes worked as an exotic dancer to bridge the financial gap.
Which brings us to a crucial psychological vulnerability. We need to talk about the inherent risks of the environments she was operating in.
The nightlife industry.
Yeah. Whether she was at an exclusive promotional party or working in a gentleman's club, she was existing in spaces where visibility is the primary product.
Right. You are interacting with a vast spectrum of people,
many of whom possess wealth and power, and some of whom possess deeply predatory intentions.
and you're navigating a world heavily lubricated by alcohol.
Exactly. Professional boundaries are constantly blurred. For a young woman trying to find stability, it requires an exhausting amount of hypervigilance to constantly assess who is a legitimate connection and who is an actual threat.
And when you are constantly hypervigilant in your professional life, you naturally crave a personal life where you can just drop your guard.
But tragically, Paula's personal life was arguably more dangerous than any nightclub she ever walked into.
Which brings us to Kevin Klim. He was 34 years old, so 8 years her senior, and by the time they touched down in Miami, they had been together for roughly a year and a half.
And calling this a volatile relationship feels like a massive understatement.
It really does.
It was a cycle of documented, escalating, mutual domestic violence. We aren't relying on neighborhood gossip here, you know. There's a stark, unavoidable paper trail of physical trauma.
Tell us about the California incident.
So in the summer of 2009, they were living in Rancho Cucamonga, California. An argument inside their home escalated to the point where Paula was arrested for allegedly shattering a glass bottle over Kevin's head.
Wow. Now, the charges against her were eventually dropped, but the violence between them didn't de-escalate. It merely went dormant until the next explosion.
Which happened just a few months later. In December 2009, they traveled back to Livonia, Michigan, to visit her family for the holidays.
You'd think being around family might temper things.
You would think so, but instead, another massive physical altercation erupted. This time, Kevin was arrested. He was accused of punching Paula in the face and breaking her nose.
Breaking her nose. I mean, that is severe.
Very severe. He was formally charged with aggravated domestic violence, and Paula's own stepfather later told reporters that these weren't just standard arguments. He said these were knockdown fights that had plagued the relationship from day one.
The psychology of this specific dynamic is incredibly important to understanding the police tunnel vision that happens later.
The trauma bond.
Exactly. What we are seeing here is textbook trauma bonding. It is the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard, followed by intense apologetic reconciliation.
It's like a drug cycle. It is. The highs of the relationship are so euphoric that they chemically bond the victim to the abuser, making the explosive, violent lows feel like aberrations rather than the baseline reality.
During this period, Paula actually texted an ex-boyfriend, explicitly stating that Kevin was trying to kill her. She literally used those words.
And if you're listening to this and thinking, well, why on earth would you stay with someone after your nose is broken and you genuinely believe they might kill you?
Right. It's the most common question people ask about abusive relationships.
You have to understand that leaving isn't just walking out a door. The psychological grip of a trauma bond makes the victim feel like they literally cannot survive without the very person who is destroying them.
Like a terrifying paradox. But here is the critical analytical pivot we have to make.
Okay.
Does a history of explosive, in-the-moment, emotionally chaotic domestic violence necessarily translate to the kind of calculated, cold-blooded cover-up we see in this murder?
And that is the defining question of the early investigation. Statistically, when a woman is murdered, law enforcement must look at the intimate partner first. The numbers just demand it.
Because it's usually the partner.
Almost always. But criminology also relies on behavioral profiling. The violence between Paula and Kevin was historically reactive, loud, and immediate.
Like a bottle smashed in an argument.
Right, or a punch thrown in a screaming match. It was the violence of lost control. The murder of Paula Sladewski, however, required supreme, terrifying control.
Strangulation is a highly intimate, physically demanding method of murder, yes.
But moving a body 12 miles through a major city, locating an obscure industrial dead end, utilizing fire to systematically destroy forensic evidence.
But that requires a totally different mindset.
It requires a cool head, local logistical knowledge, and a methodology that is fundamentally at odds with the blind panic of a domestic dispute gone wrong.
The killer wasn't just trying to flee a tragic accident, right? They were trying to completely erase the victim's existence.
But the police didn't know that yet.
Right. All they knew was that 2 days after New Year's, Kevin Klim was scheduled to be in a Michigan courtroom to answer for breaking Paula's nose.
So he had a massive motive to silence her.
Exactly. But despite that looming court date, despite the broken nose still healing, they decided to take a trip. They booked flights to Miami for New Year's Eve.
In the context of a trauma bond, this trip makes perfect tragic sense. It is the geographic cure.
The idea that changing the scenery changes the relationship.
Right. It's the desperate belief that if we just change our latitude, if we just surround ourselves with luxury and palm trees and escape the judgment of our families in Michigan, we can magically reset the relationship.
They were attempting to outrun the reality of the impending January 5th court date by hiding in the glamour of South Beach.
And for a brief window, that geographic cure seemed to work.
They checked into the La Flora Hotel on Miami Beach. They spent New Year's Eve at the Fontainebleau for the Lady Gaga concert.
And the photos from that night are just haunting.
They really are, because Paula looks genuinely radiant. She is smiling, she is dressed up, she is soaking in the exact high-energy environment she loved.
For a couple of days, they do the standard South Beach tourist routine, lounging on the beach, hitting the restaurants, basically living the fantasy they flew down to find.
But the reality of their dynamic was inevitably going to catch up with them. As the weekend draws to a close, they make a fateful decision to shift their location.
They leave the polished, relatively contained tourist hub of South Beach, and they cross the bridge into downtown Miami.
They head to a venue called Club Space. Now, if you aren't familiar with Miami nightlife, Club Space isn't just a local bar.
No, not at all.
Located at 34 Northeast 11th Street, it is a massive, multi-level, warehouse-style institution. It is a 24-hour venue.
You don't go to Club Space to have a casual drink. You go there to lose track of time.
You go to dance until the sun comes up and the world outside ceases to exist.
By the time Paula and Kevin arrive there in the early morning hours of Sunday, January 3rd, they are heavily intoxicated.
They have been partying for days.
Right. They are physically exhausted, their inhibitions are entirely stripped away, and that trauma bond powder keg is fully primed.
It is approximately 7:00 a.m. Daylight is literally breaking over downtown Miami.
But inside Club Space, the environment is intentionally designed to simulate perpetual midnight.
The bass is vibrating, the crowds are thick, and right near the bar, the tension between Paula and Kevin violently snaps. A massive physical altercation erupts between them.
Kevin later tried to downplay it in interviews. He claimed it was just a loud argument, not physical.
Of course he did.
But the club management was unequivocal. They said it was a physical fight, and it was disruptive and violent enough that the massive security apparatus of Club Space immediately descended on them.
And this brings us to a protocol that changed the entire trajectory of this case.
Yes. When you operate a mega club with thousands of patrons, liability is your biggest operational threat.
So you have to control the chaos.
Exactly. If two patrons are fighting, you cannot simply grab them both and throw them out the front doors simultaneously.
Right, because if you do that, the physical assault just continues on your sidewalk.
And someone cracks their head on the pavement and the club is sued for millions. So to mitigate this, Club Space, like many large venues, utilized a strict staggered ejection protocol.
Staggered ejection, meaning they stagger the timeline of throwing people out.
Right. Security separates the fighting parties. They take one person, physically escort them out of the building, ensure they leave the immediate premises, often by putting them in a cab, and only then do they go back inside to eject the second party.
Think of this security policy like bulkhead doors on a sinking ship. The protocol is designed to seal off the flooding, right?
Right.
It stops the fight from spilling into the streets and causing a massive riot. It compartmentalizes the danger.
But the fatal flaw of a bulkhead door is that when it seals, it traps whoever is left inside the vetted compartment.
Exactly. By strictly adhering to their de-escalation policy, the club effectively trapped Paula.
That is the exact unintended consequence. A policy designed for physical safety actively created ultimate psychological and logistical vulnerability.
Because they grabbed Kevin first.
Right. They physically escorted him to the exit, walked him outside, and put him into a waiting taxi.
And that cab sped off toward the La Flora Hotel in South Beach. Kevin was gone. The threat to the club's liability was neutralized.
But the threat to Paula was just beginning. She is left inside this massive, dark club. She is incredibly intoxicated. She is furious from the physical altercation.
And she has just been separated from her boyfriend, who is her only anchor in this city.
And to make matters worse, she has no way to contact him or anyone else because her cell phone is sitting on a nightstand back at the hotel room.
She is completely, utterly untethered in the heart of downtown Miami as the sun comes up.
The psychological state she must have been in is harrowing. She is stranded. And at 7 to 1 a.m., the club's interior surveillance cameras capture what will be the final images of Paula Sladewski alive.
It is a grainy black and white feed. The clip is agonizingly short, just a few seconds long.
What do we see on the tape?
It shows Paula walking on her own 2 feet, being flanked by a Caucasian club manager who is escorting her toward the front exit. She looks angry, she looks purposeful, walking briskly.
And then
She steps out of the frame of that camera, she walks out the front doors of club space, and she effectively vanishes from the face of the earth.
what happens in the hours immediately following that 7:21 a.m. timestamp is a terrifying void.
Despite downtown Miami having hundreds of cameras at gas stations, ATMs, and traffic lights, she is never caught on video again.
But we do have a clear timeline of what was happening back in South Beach. Kevin wakes up in their room at the La Flora Hotel later that afternoon.
So the adrenaline and alcohol have worn off.
Right. He is incredibly hungover. He looks around the room, and the bed is empty. He sees Paula's cell phone sitting there.
Now, given their history, a fight where one of them storms off wouldn't be unprecedented.
Not at all. But for her to be gone for hours in an unfamiliar city without her phone, that crosses a threshold. The reality sets in, and panic takes over.
He starts scrambling. He calls hospitals, he checks with the hotel front desk, and then he does what anyone would do. He contacts the Miami Beach Police Department to file a missing persons report.
And here is where he hits a bureaucratic brick wall that has doomed countless investigations.
The 24-hour rule.
Yes. The police tell him that because Paula is a 26-year-old adult who left a nightclub on her own accord after an argument, she has the legal right to disappear.
They inform him he has to wait 24 hours before they will officially open a missing persons case.
This 24-hour rule is one of the most dangerous, pervasive roadblocks in missing persons investigations.
Because it's not even a real law, is it?
No, it is rarely an actual law. It is almost entirely an administrative policy born out of resource management.
Meaning they just don't have the manpower to chase every angry girlfriend.
Right. Police departments receive hundreds of calls about missing adults who simply went to a friend's house to cool off, or whose cell phone battery died.
To avoid wasting detective hours on non-crimes, dispatchers enforce this waiting period.
But in cases of genuine abduction or foul play, this administrative delay is fatal.
Because it completely ignores the reality of the golden hours. We hear this term thrown around in true crime all the time, but let's actually break down what it means.
When a person is taken, the first 24 to 48 hours dictate the entire trajectory of the evidence.
Every single minute the police are forced to sit on their hands, the physical world is erasing the clues.
Exactly. Think about the mechanical degradation of evidence in a city like Miami. Surveillance systems at nearby bodegas and parking garages run on loops.
Right. If you don't pull the tape within 24 hours, the system automatically records over it.
And witnesses, the people who might have seen Paula on the street at 7:30 a.m., are tourists. By Sunday evening, they are packing their bags, driving to the airport, and flying back to Ohio or New York, taking their memories with them.
The environment itself is hostile to a cold trail. So Kevin realizes the police aren't going to help him immediately.
He's desperate.
Yeah, he opens his wallet and he bypasses the bureaucracy. He hires a private investigator named David Wasser to start digging immediately.
And this provides us with a really fascinating objective perspective on Kevin's state of mind at that time.
The PI's son, right?
Yes. David Wasser brought his 16-year-old son, Travis, along to that initial frantic meeting at the La Flora Hotel.
Years later, Travis spoke about what he witnessed in that room. He said he didn't see a cold-blooded killer trying to cover his tracks.
No, he saw a boyfriend who was in a state of absolute unvarnished terror. Travis vividly recalled watching his father fighting against that ticking clock, knowing that every passing hour was a nail in the coffin of the investigation.
While Kevin and his private investigator are desperately trying to retrace steps in South Beach, trying to figure out where a girl could walk from club space, roughly 12 miles north, the worst-case scenario is already unfolding.
We need to shift our focus back to that dead-end street at Northwest 14th Avenue and 130th Street.
It is now roughly 9:00 p.m. on Sunday. 14 hours have passed since the 7:21 a.m. surveillance footage.
The local resident has called in the dumpster fire. The fire department has extinguished the blaze.
And I want to prepare you because the forensic reality of this crime scene is incredibly grim. When we talk about a body being burned to destroy evidence, we often rely on television tropes where a body is just slightly charred.
Right, TV makes it look very clean.
Exactly. But the reality of an industrial dumpster fire is that the temperatures can easily exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It acts like a makeshift crematorium.
The thermal destruction was nearly total. The fire incinerated the clothing, the hair, the epidermis, and heavily damaged the underlying musculature and bone.
It's devastating for the evidence.
Completely. This level of heat destroys external DNA. It incinerates any fibers transferred from the killer's vehicle, and it eradicates cellular evidence under the victim's fingernails that might have indicated a struggle.
It is a highly effective forensic eraser.
The medical examiner ultimately had to rely on dental records because the enamel of the teeth and the dental amalgam can survive extreme temperatures just to legally confirm that the body was Paula Sladewski.
But despite the killer's attempt to erase the cause of death, the autopsy did reveal a crucial, horrifying fact.
What did they find?
The medical examiner was able to determine, likely by examining the internal tissues that were spared from the worst of the thermal damage, or by finding specific trauma to the hyoid bone in the neck, that the probable cause of death was strangulation.
And most importantly, they determined there was no smoke in her lungs.
Right. She was dead before the fire was set.
This sequence of events, murder by strangulation followed by post-mortem arson, is a massive psychological indicator.
How so?
Well, the fire wasn't an act of explosive rage. It wasn't the weapon used to kill her. It was a purely logistical calculation.
Right. If the goal was simply to kill Paula, the perpetrator could have left her body anywhere.
But they went to extraordinary lengths to ensure she couldn't be identified and that she couldn't be forensically linked back to them.
And this brings us to one of the most compelling aspects of the investigation, the geographical profiling.
Commander Michael Gaudio.
Yes. The lead detective on this case for the North Miami Police, he zeroed in on the location of that dumpster. This wasn't a random alleyway in downtown Miami.
No, it was 12 miles north, tucked into a labyrinthine industrial zone right next to a propane storage facility.
Commander Gaudio introduced the concept of distance decay and spatial awareness into the investigation.
In geographical profiling, there is a fundamental rule. Offenders operate within a comfort zone.
Right. People don't just drive blind.
Exactly. When a killer is transporting a body, which is the most vulnerable, high-risk phase of the entire crime, they do not rely on a GPS to find a random spot.
The anxiety of being pulled over with a body in the trunk is just too high.
They drive to a location they already know intimately.
Right, because if you are a tourist visiting Miami, you don't accidentally stumble into a dead-end industrial lot filled with commercial dumpsters.
You don't even know it exists.
Exactly. You have to know the arterial roads to get there. You have to know that it's deserted on a Sunday evening, and you have to know there are open dumpsters available.
This strongly suggests that the killer had deep, pre-existing local knowledge of North Miami.
They didn't panic and drop her in a ditch. They executed a pre-planned disposal strategy in an area where they felt geographically dominant.
So let's look at the totality of the evidence the police have on Monday morning.
Okay. They have a burned body found 12 miles from the club.
They have an autopsy pointing to strangulation.
And they have a boyfriend with a documented history of escalating violence, who is literally scheduled to stand trial in 48 hours for breaking the victim's nose.
It is the perfect storm of circumstantial guilt. The police immediately zeroed in on Kevin Klim, and frankly, any competent homicide detective would do the exact same thing.
Because the narrative just writes itself.
Right. Yes. The couple gets into a massive fight. The boyfriend is facing jail time because of her testimony. The argument escalates. He strangles her and then desperately tries to cover up the crime by burning the body.
The psychological bias to arrest him was immense.
But this is where the hard, inflexible logistics of a homicide investigation crash into the narrative bias.
We have a tendency, a cognitive bias known as the availability heuristic, to latch on to the most readily available, emotionally satisfying explanation.
We know Kevin was violent, so our brains easily categorize him as the killer.
But detectives have to prove opportunity. And Kevin's opportunity simply did not exist.
The timeline cleared him with surgical precision.
Tell me about the taxi records.
So investigators pulled the surveillance footage from club space, which definitively showed Kevin being escorted out by security long before Paula left.
Yep.
They then subpoenaed the records from the taxi company. They tracked the specific cab that picked Kevin up outside the club, and the GPS and dispatch logs proved that the cab drove directly to the La Flora Hotel in South Beach.
And they checked the hotel records too, right?
Yes. Hotel surveillance and electronic keycard data corroborated that Kevin entered his room and stayed there.
And then you have the physical logistics of the disposal. How does a guy who just took a taxi back to a hotel, who does not have a rental car, pull off this crime?
He doesn't. To believe Kevin committed this murder, you have to believe an impossible logistical sequence.
What would he have had to do?
You have to believe that he bypassed hotel security, slipped out undetected, somehow procured a vehicle in the middle of the night without renting or stealing one on record.
Managed to track down Paula, who was wandering aimlessly without a cell phone in a crowded downtown metropolis.
Convinced her to get into his car despite their violent fight.
Strangle her.
Inherently knew how to navigate 12 miles to a specific North Miami industrial dead end he had never visited.
Set a fire and returned to his hotel room in time to wake up and feign panic for a private investigator.
The window of opportunity was too small, and the lack of a vehicle made the transportation of the body physically impossible.
The evidence was so indisputably in his favor that even Paula's own family had to accept it.
Which is saying something.
Her sister, Kelly Ferris, who became an absolute warrior for justice in this case, publicly stated that she did not believe Kevin was the killer. She pointed directly to the logistics. They didn't have a car. He didn't know the area.
It takes an incredible amount of intellectual honesty and fortitude for a grieving family member to publicly clear a man who historically abused their sister.
It shows that Kelly Ferris was looking strictly at the evidence, recognizing that focusing their anger on Kevin would only allow the real killer to escape.
But if you go online today, if you venture into the comment sections of YouTube documentaries or Reddit threads about Paula's case, you will find thousands of people who absolutely refuse to believe Kevin is innocent.
They cling to the domestic violence history and ignore the cab records. Why do we as a society have such a profound inability to let go of a suspect when the hard science clears them?
It's rooted in the narrative fallacy. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. We crave stories that make logical, thematic sense.
A toxic, violent relationship ending in murder is a closed loop, right? It makes narrative sense.
It allows us to believe that violence is predictable and localized. But accepting that Kevin didn't do it forces us to confront a much more terrifying reality.
It forces us to accept that the world is governed by random, overlapping chaos.
We have to accept the horrifying coincidence that an opportunistic predator just happened to be watching at the exact moment a toxic relationship left a young woman completely vulnerable on the street.
We prefer the devil we know over the random monster in the dark.
Exactly. And Kevin wasn't content to just sit back and be quietly cleared by the police. He was furious.
He and his private investigator had been scrutinizing that 7.21 a.m. surveillance footage, and they developed a deeply disturbing theory.
If Kevin didn't kill her, his camp pointed the finger directly at the men who were last seen with her, the club's space security team.
Kevin went on a massive media offensive. He appeared on national television, including an interview on the Today Show, and leveled a massive accusation of coordinated predation against the club.
He laid out this theory. When he and Paula first arrived at Club Space, he claimed a specific bouncer at the door heavily scrutinized Paula's ID.
Not just checking her age, but showing a suspicious, lingering interest in her.
Kevin's theory suggested that this initial interest evolved into a conspiracy. He claimed that the security staff deliberately orchestrated the ejection to isolate Paula.
They intentionally kicked him out first, knowing it would leave this beautiful, highly intoxicated woman alone in their custody.
This is the opportunistic predation theory, and from a psychological standpoint, it is a nightmare scenario.
It suggests that the people whose explicit job it is to protect patrons from harm were actually using the club's strict safety protocols as a weapon.
Kevin looked at the grainy footage of Paula being escorted out and claimed that the men trailing her weren't simply doing their jobs. He suggested they were a pack of predators guiding their prey out into the dawn.
Now, if you are Louis Puig, the owner of Club Space, you do not take an accusation of institutional murder lightly.
The club fought back immediately, and they didn't just use PR spin, they used hard data.
The club's defense was methodical and factual. First, they addressed the physical description of the man in the video.
Kevin had insinuated that the bouncers who threw him out were the ones who took Paula.
But the club pointed out that the man physically escorting Paula on the 7.21 a.m. tape was a Caucasian floor manager with no facial hair, which completely contradicted the physical descriptions of the bouncers Kevin claimed had targeted them.
Second, they handed over their time cards and the entirety of their interior and exterior surveillance footage to the homicide detectives.
They proved categorically that every single member of their security staff was accounted for inside the building during the hours Paula went missing.
Nobody abandoned their post, slipped out the back door, and followed Paula down the street.
And they went even further to demonstrate their cooperation. A few weeks after the murder, employees at Club Space actually dialed 911 because they spotted a man walking past the club who they believed matched the description of someone they had seen talking to Paula that night.
The police arrived, detained the man, and interviewed him. He was ultimately cleared and released, but the incident proved that the club staff was actively vigilant and trying to aid the investigation.
Not cover up a crime committed by one of their own. The police thoroughly investigated the staff and definitively ruled them out.
So the boyfriend's timeline clears him. The club's surveillance and time cards clear the staff. It feels like the investigation is hitting a brick wall.
But the police did have one major lead. They had a witness who came forward with a description, and from that description, a composite sketch was generated.
This sketch is the face of the ghost that has haunted the Miami police for over a decade.
The witness reported seeing Paula shortly after she exited Club Space at 7:21 a.m. She was seen in a nearby parking lot area, and she was not alone.
She was seen with a stocky, light-skinned, black or Hispanic male, approximately 6 feet tall, sporting a goatee.
But the most chilling detail the witness provided was their physical posture. They were allegedly holding hands.
Holding hands, that detail stops you in your tracks.
I mean, think about it. Paula has just been in a brutal physical fight with her boyfriend. She is furious, she is intoxicated, and she is stranded.
Holding hands implies a level of familiarity or a rapid, intense psychological coercion. How does a stranger convince a woman in that state to hold his hand?
It suggests the predator didn't approach her with outward aggression. He approached her playing the role of the savior.
She is standing on the sidewalk. She has no phone. Her boyfriend is gone. This man approaches, speaks calmly, maybe offers to help her find a cab or offers her a ride back to South Beach.
In her vulnerable, exhausted state, she accepts the lifeline. The hand-holding might have been him guiding her to his vehicle.
But there is a bombshell revelation about this mysterious man that completely reframes how we look at the entire night.
Right. This detail did not get nearly enough mainstream media attention. Paula's brother, Thomas Bussell, gave an interview where he revealed a crucial piece of information about the man in that composite sketch.
According to the family's understanding of the events, this mysterious man in the parking lot wasn't just a random stranger who happened to be walking by when Paula was kicked out.
He was supposedly the underlying catalyst for the massive 7:00 a.m. fight inside the club.
According to this account, Kevin told investigators that he saw this exact man, the stocky man with the goatee, approach Paula on the crowded dance floor and inappropriately grab her by the waist.
Kevin reacted violently to this intrusion. The fight broke out, the security team descended, and the staggered ejection protocol was initiated.
If that theory is true, it is one of the most chilling examples of predatory calculation imaginable.
Think about the analogy of the bulkhead doors again. This killer didn't just wait outside for a vulnerable person to stumble out.
He walked into the club, identified his target, and intentionally triggered the alarm to seal the doors.
He deliberately provoked the boyfriend, knowing that in a club like Space, security would immediately intervene and separate them.
He used the club's own liability protocols as a weapon to sever Paula from her only protection.
He gets the boyfriend thrown out in a cab, he waits patiently for Paula to be ejected alone, and then he swoops in on the sidewalk, offering a helping hand to the very woman whose crisis he just engineered.
It is a terrifyingly sophisticated psychological maneuver, and it perfectly explains why she might have been receptive to him outside.
She didn't know he provoked Kevin. She just knew Kevin was gone and she was stranded.
But despite this incredibly specific behavioral profile, despite having a detailed composite sketch showing his height, build, and facial hair, this man has proven to be an absolute phantom.
The frustration for the investigators is just agonizing. They threw everything at this. There was an $18,000 reward offered for information.
The composite sketch was broadcast to millions of homes.
The case was featured on America's Most Wanted, which has an incredible track record of catching fugitives. It was given a full-hour deep exploration on Dateline NBC.
Yet not a single viable tip identified the man in the sketch.
The police even tracked down 2 abandoned cars in the Miami area that they believed might be connected to the suspect or the transportation of the body.
They impounded them, tore them apart, looking for DNA, trace fibers, or anything that could link back to Paula or the man in the sketch.
Both cars led to absolute dead ends.
It is as if this man materialized inside Club Space to orchestrate this tragedy and then evaporated into the Miami humidity.
And that evaporation leaves a permanent, gaping wound for the people left behind. The human toll of an unsolved murder doesn't diminish with time, it compounds.
You look at Commander Michael Gaudio, he was a veteran detective, a guy who had investigated countless homicides in South Florida.
When he eventually retired from the force, he sat down for interviews and openly admitted that Paula's murder is the one case that fundamentally broke him.
He said the inability to provide answers, to give her family any semblance of justice, is something that still keeps him awake at night.
And then you have Kelly Ferris, Paula's sister. She didn't just retreat into her grief, she waged a relentless campaign.
For years, she flew back and forth from Michigan to Florida, spending her own money, organizing press conferences, standing in front of microphones, pleading with the public.
She was desperately trying to shake loose just one memory, one tourist who might have snapped a photo outside club space, one person who might recognize the goatee in the sketch.
Living your life in a state of perpetual, desperate vigilance is a grueling, heartbreaking existence.
As we look back at the totality of this investigation, I want us to focus on the geography one last time. We have this composite sketch of a phantom.
We have an obscure industrial dumping ground 12 miles north of the club.
We have a fire meant to erase every forensic tie. Are we looking at this wrong? Have we been making a fundamental assumption that is blinding us to the killer's identity?
This is where we need to challenge these standard tenets of geographical profiling.
The assumption throughout the investigation has been residential familiarity.
Right. The police believed the killer lived in or near North Miami, which is why he knew about the dead-end street at Northwest 14th Avenue.
But what if his knowledge of that propane lot and those commercial dumpsters didn't come from where he slept? What if it came from how he made his living?
Wait, you mean occupational familiarity? Like his job required him to know the layout of the industrial parks?
Exactly. Look at the specific environment. It is a dead-end street flanked by commercial warehouses and filled with industrial dumpsters.
Who holds the mental map of every commercial dumpster across a 12-mile radius of a major metropolitan city?
A waste management worker, an industrial delivery driver, a night shift commercial contractor.
That completely flips the profile.
It does. If the man in the sketch drove a garbage truck or a commercial box truck, his vehicle would be entirely invisible in an industrial park on a Sunday evening.
If a police cruiser drove by and saw a commercial truck parked next to a dumpster, they wouldn't look twice because the vehicle naturally belongs in that habitat.
Furthermore, someone in that profession would know exactly which dumpsters were scheduled to be emptied on which days.
They would know exactly where a fire could burn inside a steel container long enough and hot enough to destroy a human body before anyone in the residential areas noticed the smoke.
That is a chilling, entirely plausible theory. It bridges the gap between the flashy, high-visibility nightlife of downtown Miami and the gritty, invisible concrete infrastructure of the city's industrial zones.
It changes the profile from a local resident who panicked and dumped a body near his house to a mobile predator who knew how to use the city's blind spots, its service alleys, and its industrial schedules to his absolute advantage.
The evidence strongly points away from the chaotic violence of the boyfriend and squarely at the cold calculation of the ghost in the sketch.
But the ultimate tragedy of Paula Sladewski's story is that the deafening noise of her toxic relationship created the perfect smokescreen.
The explosive fight, the arrests, the history of abuse, it all provided a massive, blinding distraction that allowed the real killer to slip quietly out the back door while everyone was looking at Kevin.
So, as you think about the timeline we've walked through today, what detail snags in your mind? Is it the unintended consequence of the club's bulkhead doors?
Is it the 24-hour rule that let the golden hours slip away? Somewhere out there, a man matching that sketch is walking around.
He knows the layout of those dumpsters. He knows how to use a club's security against a patron.
He is carrying the absolute truth of what happened in the dark void between the pulsing lights of that dance floor and the smoke of that burning dumpster. And until someone recognizes his face, Paula's canvas remains erased.